Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Conversations Over Coffee with me, Rabbi Steve Warnick. Today, I am delighted to present Dr. Aurel Braun as my guest. We're going to be talking about Ukraine and Russia and the Jewish Agency, and not only an update as to what's happening with the war, but also the impact it's having on some NGOs, including the Jewish Agency. Before we get to that, we are on Facebook, YouTube, and bethzedeck.tv. If you like today's conversation, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Comments are always appreciated and help us get the conversation to more people. If you have questions for our guests, please put them in the Facebook or YouTube chat, and we will do our best to bring them into the show. With that out of the way, let me introduce Dr. Aurel Braun, who is currently a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. He's also a center associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. Additionally, he is senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and a fellow and senator of Trinity College, all at the University of Toronto. Professor Braun has published extensively on communist affairs and strategic studies, with a special focus on the problems of the transformation of the socialist systems in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. He's a specialist in international law. He's the author and/or editor of several books. His latest is NATO-Russia Relations in the 21st Century. His forthcoming book is on Russia, the West, and Arctic security, which I know is something that is a very great concern for Canada. Please welcome Dr. Aurel Braun. Hi, Aurel.
Hello.
Is there, your bio is so extensive that I condensed it a little bit. Is there anything that that you think is missing that we should say before we begin our conversation?
Well, you were very kind. At one point, I also headed a large human rights organization, which allowed me to have a kind of insight into what has happened, how some of these major international organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have transmogrified from organizations that were genuinely committed to human rights to ones that have now a very distorted view. And these are two organizations that are very lavishly funded, which spend a great deal of time bashing Israel.
I think that would be an interesting conversation for another time, which is the transformation of human rights organizations, and really, I think even beyond that, there's what to talk about in terms of both the way in which the extreme left and the extreme right have really been radicalized in the last several decades. But for now, let's focus on Russia and Ukraine. As someone who's a news junkie, as I am, it seems that something's changed in the war in recent weeks. Specifically, we saw the assassination or the murder, depending on whether or not it's politically motivated or not, of the far right nationalist, the daughter of the nationalist, who's also a nationalist in her own right, just a couple of days ago in a car bomb. And we're also seeing what appears to be Ukrainian forces operating in Crimea behind Russian lines. You must be following this in a way much more intensely than certainly I am and others are. Can you give us an update, a briefing, so to speak, of what the current state of the war is and the significant things that people in the public should be aware of?
There have been many surprises in a sense that Ukraine has been able to hold out this long, and even that they are able to engage in some counteroffensives. Ukraine has been getting more weapons. They've been begging for weapons for a long time. They have not been getting what they asked for and what they needed. They're getting a little bit more now. That gives them additional capability. So they have been able to largely stop the Russians in the east, and they are making some progress in the south, where they need to retake certain regions, especially Kherson. So we see prodding operations, and Crimea is an area that Russia thought was entirely safe, even though they annexed it illegally, and the Ukrainian forces are, in one way or another, telling the Russians you are not safe anywhere in the occupied territories. The question, though, is what happens in the future? Will the West tire of supporting Ukraine? We hear a great many voices from the left, but especially from the isolationist right in the United States, in Europe, that Ukraine is not worth supporting. Why don't we reach some accommodation with the Russians? And Vladimir Putin has came in with the attitude that geopolitics are what matter, that power is what matters. And historically, this is not something new. We just thought we transcended it. You read Thucydides 2,500 years ago, the Melian Dialogue, and there's a very famous line where the Athenians are making demands on the Melians, and they say to the Melians, "You can't stay neutral. You better understand the geopolitical reality, and that is the powerful do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." And this has been Vladimir Putin's attitude, and this is why it makes him so very dangerous. It is why what is happening in Ukraine is not a local issue, it is a global concern.
Well, that's certainly been the message that's been coming from Western leaders about the war and the willingness, it seems, and perhaps to Putin's surprise, of the way in which the NATO allies have really unified around Ukraine in this fight. And yet, I'm I find it curious that Sweden and Finland are like now suddenly NATO members or members of Europe, and it's like their status is being accelerated. But Ukraine is still like, we're supporting Ukraine, but not so far as actually letting them in. It still seems like though this isn't just about Ukraine, but yet Ukraine is somehow being treated as a stepchild.
It is odd, and I think your observation is a very important one because logically one would think that if you really want to help Ukraine, you would like to allow Ukrainians to make a choice. And their choice seems to be the vast majority of the people of Ukraine would like to join NATO. But there are alliance realities, and that is you need to meet certain criteria to join the alliance. Whether it's civilian control over the military, whether it is that you don't have disputes with other countries on your borders, a certain level of development. Ukraine is not quite there. What is fascinating and also very meaningful about the fact that Sweden and Finland are joining, they have not yet joined formally because there has to be a process of ratification. The vast majority of the legislatures in NATO states, 30 states, and soon to be 32, have ratified, but not all, is that these were two countries that were not only neutral, but these are two Scandinavian countries that had bent over backwards over many decades to try to be accommodating to Russia, not to provoke Russia, to have good relations, constructive relations with Russia. And yet they were driven into NATO's arms because of Russian behavior. Russia is not a victim. Russia is a country that has agency. And if they can alienate these countries, Finland and Sweden, to the point where they dramatically turned around, before the conflict in Ukraine, the majority of Finns did not wish to join NATO. After the invasion, the majority decided that they want to join NATO. It tells us something about the strategic miscalculations by Vladimir Putin.
And also I always defer to people who live in the area about certain things, right? So clearly, Western leaders might talk about this isn't, Vladimir Putin is not going to end with Ukraine. Clearly what's motivating them is the very real belief that if he can do this to Ukraine, he can do this to Finland too. And their history, of course, it's only been 100 years, a little more than 100 years that Finland's been independent or outside of the sphere of influence of Russia. So clearly the Finns and the Swedes believe that Putin would not stop here. And that's why they need that extra protection Do you think that protection, like, at what point does it, what do you think that protection is real, in the sense of, you know, Putin's doing whatever he wants with Ukraine. Biden has made it very clear that he's wants to avoid and in some ways I'm happy about this, or he wants to avoid a nuclear war at all costs. I mean, like, we should avoid a nuclear war. But I'm just wondering, because if Russia has a willingness to use force to enter Ukraine and possibly other countries, if NATO is NATO really prepared to respond to that force with force if it enters a NATO protected country? What's the difference between Ukraine and Finland, right? If Russia were to go into Finland, does he really believe the credible use of force from NATO, or is this still some sort of crazy chess game?
Let me try to unpack some of the things that you said, Rabbi, because you put in a great deal into that basket of questions,
yeah,
and assumptions, which I think are really worth sort of taking piece by piece. There are those who are arguing that the reason why Vladimir Putin has engaged in this aggression against Ukraine is because of NATO enlargement. This is something that is pushed by those who pursue what I call crude realism, people like Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. And their idea is that if only NATO had not enlarged, if only Russia was not provoked, Vladimir Putin would have stayed behind his boundaries and everything would have been fine. And even now, let's have some kind of settlement where if we only get Ukraine to agree that they will never join NATO, this would lead to some kind of contour of an agreement. And I think this could not be more wrong, because it really fundamentally misunderstands what is happening inside Russia. And what happens inside Russia is also profoundly important in terms of Russian external behavior. As some have written many times over, foreign policy starts at home. And it was no accident that repression increased tremendously in Russia. Economic failure was greater in Russia prior to the invasion, and there were those signals domestically that, in a sense, Vladimir Putin needed an external diversion. And when he began this conflict, his demands were not only regarding Ukraine, his demands also related to NATO, saying, you must dismantle in many ways that what happened in the alliance post-1997, which would have left Poland, the Baltic states, absolutely defenseless. And these countries had fairly limited power in terms of their military because they had reduced their militaries, including Poland. Worse than that, Germany, the largest country on the continent, the largest economy, in Germany, the armed forces have been reduced to an extent where about 1/3 of the Air Force could not fly, where Germany was incapable of fulfilling its NATO role. Angela Merkel was in many ways a very commendable leader, but she had a kind of blind spot when it came to military power. They also allowed themselves, the Germans, to become energy dependent on Russia. So Russia would use a kind of pipeline diplomacy, a way of squeezing the Western countries, Germany in particular, in order to make political gains. So all of these things were at work, and they were designed basically to allow Vladimir Putin to use external crises, external successes, the conquest of Crimea, to divert popular attention away in Russia from domestic failures. Because in many ways, Russia is a failed state.
So it's a wag the dog kind of circumstance.
Well, I use what I call a 30-year rule. And if you look at 30 years after the end of the Second World War, and you look at the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, militaristic Japan, These were countries that had no culture of democracy, that had weak civil societies. But 30 years later, by 1975, all three of them, West Germany, because East Germany, small portion was under Soviet rule, but Germany in that way, Italy and Japan were vibrant democracies with extremely successful, highly competitive economies. Now look at Russia 30 years after the fall of communism and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, 1991, so you take last year. Russia had a GDP that in nominal terms is comparable to that of Italy's. On a per capita basis, they are poorer than the Italians and the Turks. Russia's exports were always over 60% energy. Russia has no Silicon Valley. You don't know many people, certainly I don't, who drive a Russian car, use a Russian computer, or take Russian medicine. So all those kind of standards of success of a modern economy are missing in Russia. Yes, there are pockets of excellence, but Russia really is not a modern state. It is a very large kleptocracy. And Vladimir Putin runs that kleptocracy. Sometimes he's in search of some kind of ideology. This is where people like Dugin came in, because they gave a kind of veneer, an ideological veneer to what essentially is a kleptocracy. But because the main goal of Vladimir Putin is to stay in power, the greatest fear that he has is not NATO, but the greatest fear, the specter, to use a Marxist term, the specter that is haunting Russia is democracy. What Vladimir Putin could not allow Ukraine is to have a Slavic state become a successful democracy that could contaminate, so to speak, and spread into Russia. And so these external actions are designed to divert and to prevent, to avoid democracy.
And would you say that the Russian government, I mean, it seems like Zelensky has been extremely successful as a wartime leader. And that based on that analysis, Aurel, Putin's already lost, right? I mean, if his goal was to disrupt and destroy a nascent, strong political entity in Ukraine, the outcome of this war seems to be the opposite.
Well, this is where the difference is between the tactical and the strategic. And one might say that Vladimir Putin has been a clever tactician, but he has been disastrous as a strategist. But this is not to say...
But even as a tactician, he doesn't seem to be succeeding in this particular conflict.
Well, he has caused a huge amount of damage in Ukraine. He's holding on to about 20% of Ukraine. There are many voices in the West that would like to let Russia have that, so they would have the rewards of that aggression. And we need to understand how close Vladimir Putin came to victory. Because the advice of the Biden administration to Zelensky was, on the day of the invasion,
get out.
Flee, get out. And what was the response? It was an epic, almost a Churchillian kind of line, which was, I am not looking for a ride. I need ammunition. Now, just think of the scenario. What would have happened if Zelensky had fled?
Ukraine would have fallen.
Ukraine would have collapsed.
Yeah.
Russian forces would be in Kiev. Vladimir Putin would be hailed as one of the strategic geniuses in the world. He would have held Ukraine, and it would have threatened the rest of NATO. And this is where Western deterrence has failed. This is where Western negligence to address dependence on Russian energy, to realize that soft power is important, but you also need hard power. This is the sad reality of the current world, that you can't just keep spending 1% of your GDP on weapons when you have China and Russia acting in very aggressive ways. That is a reality that has to be confronted. And yes, we all want to avoid nuclear war, but that is why we have nuclear deterrence. You cannot allow Russia or China to use nuclear blackmail.
Right. one more question before I change to some of the impact that this is having on organizations such as the Jewish Agency. What's the way? How do you see this being resolved? I mean, what's the way out of this?
It depends a great deal, not only on Ukraine, and obviously they need to sustain their morale. They have to keep improving their military capabilities, training, and so on. But we need to continue to invest in Ukrainian forces, support Ukraine militarily, politically, and economically. If that is done, Ukraine will have the capacity to push the Russians back. Maybe not all the way, but at least to a point where there could be meaningful negotiations where Ukraine would get most of its territory back, and there could be some kind of modus vivendi. But if we fail to do that, this can turn around. The Russians have a great deal of mass. Vladimir Putin does not care about the Russian casualties. He not only is prepared to destroy Ukrainian lives, he is also willing to use his own troops as cannon fodder. And that makes him extremely dangerous. And so the West cannot lose focus. And if we don't lose focus, there is hope. But sadly, the history of the West is that we tend to have a short attention span.
Yeah, about 14 minutes. All right. So one of the things that a lot of people are speculating on is that the Jewish Agency for Israel has been operating in Russia since the end of the Iron Curtain, and has been there both to assist with Aliyah, helping those Russians that wish to go to Israel to do so, to raise and support Jewish life, the resurgence of Jewish life within Russia, and through the support of Jewish community centers, through Birthright, camps, Jewish educational programs, and so forth. In order to do that work, especially the work for Aliyah, you have to collect personal data about the people that wish to make Aliyah. Russia, several months ago, informed the Jewish Agency that it was violating the law in terms of the collection of personal data about Russian citizens, and is now threatening to either severely curtail or shut down Jewish Agency activities within Russia. There was a court case that was supposed to happen. There was a hearing last week in which the judge delayed the first hearing of the case, presumably to allow for further negotiations between Israel and Russia to solve the problem themselves. There's a lot of speculation that this is Russian payback for Israel's stance on the war. What insight do you have from your studies and your knowledge of Russia as to what's going on and the impact that this will have on organizations like the Jewish Agency?
Well, again, Rabbi, if I may go back and try to unpack all of this and go from the big picture to the specifics and use a kind of Occam razor to try to cut through to the first principles, we need to understand that Russia is not a country where you have rights. There are no constitutional rights. Vladimir Putin has shown that that is a myth. Yes, they have a constitution, but it is meaningless. And it is meaningless because there is no rule of law in Russia by the standards that we use to judge what rule of law is. There is no due process. And I mentioned earlier that one of the signs that something was really amiss was that several months before the invasion of Ukraine, there was action by the Russian government, very harsh action, not only against political opponents like Navalny getting jailed. Well, first they tried to poison and kill him, and when he came back, they jailed him for being absent for treatment, part of the charges. But it was also the case that civil society organizations were being restricted. And that is because you don't have rights, you only have privileges. So in a sense, the Jewish agency was privileged to allow to continue longer than some other civil society organizations. And so when you have privileges rather than rights, you are dependent on the political leadership. And Vladimir Putin has not acted as an anti-Semite, and we have almost this kind of tyranny of low expectations to say, well, it's wonderful. At least he's not anti-Semitic. We don't ask the fundamental question, does he respect any rights? And he doesn't. And privileges.
He's not an anti-Semite. He's an equal opportunity dictator.
Well, that's certainly one way to put it. But unfortunately, within the security services and within the military, there is a tremendous amount of not just anti-Israeli feeling, but outright anti-Semitism, because there has been a kind of elite persistence from the Soviet days. There's never been a cleansing of these organizations. And so you have this very basic problem that there is a systemic issue. So the Jewish agency operates on the basis of privilege. And now we're talking about court cases, but the reality is there are no independent courts. So it's not as if we're waiting for the judge to make a reasoned decision that clever lawyers will present an excellent and persuasive case. This will be a political decision on the part of the Putin government. Will they continue to make an exception for the Jewish agency because they have clamped down on so many other civil society organizations?
So what I hear you saying is that it's possible to view the clampdown on the Jewish agency not as exceptional because of the Jewish part of it, but as part of the larger clampdown of these NGOs that operate based on the privilege of the Putin government.
I think it's important to understand it. Now, is it also a matter where the Putin government is using this, denying this privilege, to put pressure on Israel and to say to the Jewish community worldwide that do not support Ukraine? Or Israel's prime minister, Lapid, may have said something that the Russians found unpleasant. That may also be part of it. So it's not a single factor explanation. But I think the basic element is this understanding what we need to have, that at best in Russia, you only have privilege. You do not have rights.
So unless there's a political solution to this, we're probably going back to the good old days of the Iron Curtain when it comes to Aliyah.
It's not a good picture. I'm not sure we're going to go all the way back because they're not the same kind of restrictions leaving, but it's a difficult situation. And you know, Rabbi, that tens of thousands have already left, Jews have left Russia because they get a sense that this is a period of grave danger.
Yeah, so I actually know those statistics because I'm the vice chair of the Aliyah committee for the Sochnut, for the Jewish agency. There have been almost 40,000 Ukrainians and Russians that have left Ukraine and Russia for Israel, just on Aliyah. These are Russian and Ukrainian Jews on Aliyah, almost 40,000 since the war began. And there's an expectation of another 10 to 20,000 coming before the end of this calendar year. It's the largest Jewish refugee crisis since World War II. And there's a lot of Russians that are trying to get out now while they still can, and there's all sorts of work being done as to what happens if Russia changes the requirements. How do we help Russian Olim get out? And you're right. When the war started, there were a lot of people who realized that this was not gonna. There were a lot of Russians who understood what it potentially meant for them, which is why they started to leave en masse, especially young people. Last word, Professor. Leave us with. Can you leave us something hopeful and optimistic about this crisis?
There is reason to be optimistic because just think back to the first days of the war, when it was widely assumed that Ukraine was going to collapse. it was assumed that Russia then would be able to increasingly intimidate Europe. When the West Europeans appeared to be very keen on appeasement, including people like Emmanuel Macron would say, Russia must not be humiliated. And here was Boris Johnson, who's a very quirky character, but he had a strategic vision. He said, Russia must fail in its aggression and must be seen to fail. And there is hope of doing that, but it depends a good deal on us. Olaf Scholz is visiting Canada, and I think it would be wise for us to say to Chancellor Scholz, you have made promises that Germany will rearm, that Germany will help Ukraine, and we hope that you will keep those promises.
Yeah, I think that's right. For another time, we should have the conversation about the Arctic, I was reading about the new bases that Russia's been building in the Arctic and the icebreakers that they have compared to Canada's, I think, single working icebreaking ship up in the Arctic. And if Russia's playing these games in Central Europe with Ukraine, we also have to watch the North to see how they might be testing us.
Just to give you one statistic, as we're about to leave, if the Northern Sea route becomes viable, and with melting sea ice and Arctic ice, it may be, that could reduce shipping costs by 30%, and the length of the route of shipping from the Far East to Europe and also by 30%. That would be a dramatic change. Russia has militarized the Arctic to be able to control that.
Yeah, and that's, there's multiple things that are problematic about that. First and foremost is the impact of climate change and the melting ice caps, and what that means for the world. But as you said, if Russia's already militarizing that, and that comes to happen, that will have, if we think the supply chains and inflation is bad now, just imagine what would happen if that were to come to pass. Lots to talk about, Professor, and I have to say I love these conversations. I don't know if I told you I'm a political science major as an undergrad, so I love these kinds of conversations. It's one of my favorite subjects, and maybe one of these days I'll audit a class that you're taking, because I really enjoyed these conversations. Thank you for taking the time and for sharing your insight with us. For those that are joining us, we hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Please remember to share it and make a comment. We really appreciate that, and join us in the future here at betzedek.tv for conversations over coffee. Have a good week, everyone. Thanks, Professor. Bye-bye.
Thank you.